Welcome to the Home Studio Hangout podcast, where we explore what it's like building, running, and working out of a home studio with your hosts, Joshua Matotek, Andrew Simmons, and many guests in different areas of the music industry.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Home Studio Hangout podcast. My name is Drew. This episode is me and my good friend Ian Joshua Riley. We had a long conversation and I decided to split it up into two episodes. So the first episode is going to be more about who is Ian and him getting involved and kind of helping grow the Atlanta music scene and his involvement in bands there and production and growing as a songwriter and the people that he's been able to work with. So regardless of when you're watching this, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Ian Joshua Riley, Mr. IJR himself. And welcome back to the Home Studio Hangout podcast. I am your host, Drew. Josh is not here with me today, but I am joined by my friend, Mr. IJR himself, Ian Joshua Riley, from the Atlanta scene. Ian's been a good friend of mine for a really long time, and I'm really excited to have him on. We've been wanting to do this, but I wanted to make it, worthwhile for you as well to be able to, talk about some stuff. So now we can finally do it. Mr. Ian, how you doing?
Dude, I'm doing so good. How are you today?
I'm doing decent today, dude. I had a weird slow morning and I didn't get started until around 10.
Yeah. I feel that.
So yeah, I don't know. It's been kind of a weird day, but I'm excited to kind of give the people of Home Studio Hangout like an introduction to you. So let's start this way. Let's give a concise summary of like who you are, your general story, and then how you got into music and how you got into doing. We'll start with how you got into doing music production, and then we'll move from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the easiest way to put it would be, it's funny because I think before we knew a lot of each other's mutuals, you and I both just in general kind of existed in similar spheres of the Southeast music scene, especially in like the church music scenes and like post-hardcore and that kind of thing. And indie rock, a lot of that too, that like the crossover that those things had in the 2000s.
For sure.
And so I grew up going to a lot of those like shows and stuff that a lot of our mutual friends went to, and that a lot of our friends' bands got started in, who went on to become some bigger bands. And that cycle has just continued. But I'd say that the beginning of my foray into music production, if I had to go all the way back, truly, it would really started when I was like 14 or 15. And I just wanted to have demos to have on MySpace because you weren't a real band unless you had like at least a recording, or unless you'd played a show, or both, because then you were like really legit, especially in like metal and hardcore back then. Yeah. And like punk. So for me, it was like I downloaded Audacity and a cracked version of FL Studio to program drums and like the old Fruity Loops, like from like 07. Yeah. And that was how I made like my first recordings with like that, and like a Digitech RP250 pedal like that I would plug my guitar into and directly into the computer. And I still have that thing laying around here somewhere. But it's funny, I didn't fancy myself a producer. I didn't understand what production truly meant in terms of like vision or like songs yet. I didn't know what I was doing was producing. I thought that I was just doing the necessary thing of like, this is my idea in my head, and if I can record it, then I at least can represent it. And then maybe I can go to like a real like recording studio, like a boutique studio with like a real producer. Yeah. And then they'll be able to, make me good once I have money, or when my band gets signed or whatever. And so eventually, being in the Atlanta area and being in the scene that we were in, that I was talking to you about, it wasn't long before I was like in the same circles as like a lot of people doing stuff in like Christian rock and like Christian hardcore and stuff like that. And so my first real producer that I interned for, who's still one of my best friends today, his name is Tim Jones. He let me intern for him for a couple years, and he produced my band 10th Row's first EP, and he was just like super super helpful dude. Like he taught at SAE, the School of Audio Engineering. He's not there anymore. He does he does stuff for the Grammys now. It's incredible. But he kind of like let me just hang around and like learn Pro Tools by like osmosis, and I would be like, dude, what is all this? Like, and I'd be like freaking out because like I thought I was like messing something up, and he's like, dude, it's not rocket science. And then eventually we started doing some sessions over at Glow in the Dark Studios around the same time that our mutual friends who you've had on the podcast, Lee Rouse and Josh Landry, were also there, and they had actually recorded my band, same band. They had recorded our first demo in Lee's mom's house back then. And so we all just kind of, what was funny is our little scene, a lot of us kind of converged around Glow in the Dark Studios at the same time. And I started interning for Matt Goldman, who, you know, a lot of people here would probably know as like Under Oath and As Cities Burn, Copeland, and Berlin fame. But besides that, he also like he's worked on like Casting Crowns and like Third Day and all these other people. And he's an incredible dude to like be around when you're in that kind of recording environment, working on bands with like drums and stuff, you know, and just kind of like getting a really organic feel. And I got to learn a lot just being there, but half of it was from watching him and the other half was just kind of being there like after hours, like editing stuff. Like you were there with me once after hours.
Oh yeah.
And it was, yeah. And it was like, and it was just kind of like this thing of like self-sufficiency was always this thing that I was learning at the time that I didn't realize how it was going to play a part later in my career as a producer or just as a musician. But I would just kind of spend a lot of time in Pro Tools before I had my own license or before I had anything really. And just because these people would let me be in their studios around all their gear, I would just be like, you know I know I don't know everything about all this, but I know enough to get what's in my head into this computer using what's around me. And so now I just have to figure it out and how to edit it and make it sound good. And so those were like kind of my earliest days, like kind of figuring out like just, you know, everything between high school in the late 2000s to like interning at that studio in like 2016, 2017, 2018. And him kind of just letting me be there as much as he did and intern on some of his projects. It kind of like exposed me to like the earliest impressions that I had about like how to like use parallel compression like correctly and how to like you know, just, you know, EQing and just dialing in like very acoustic instruments and stuff like that. But what I learned around Goldman as well that was really cool was that something innate that I understood that I didn't realize was innate or that was even really a skill was a propensity for like songs and like songwriting. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like it's like in terms of like, go ahead, sorry.
I was just gonna say he has a very good sense of song. More he doesn't get credited for that, I don't think enough. Because I mean, so in our general circle, like I've had the pleasure of working with him, you've had the pleasure of working with him, Chris Bowman has had the pleasure of working alongside him on a couple different records. And it's a sense of like you always know him for these big dark drums and heavy hitting, like not heavy hitting in the sense of like down tuned always, but sometimes, but then also these punchy records. And but you never
like more
really
modern takes on like the Beatles type production, just with thicker, roomier sounds. That's like
that's what I always think of, and that's what most people think of when you think of Matt Goldman. But also, what you don't realize is how well that man understands melody and good writing. Because working with, even Bowman said this working on the record that he worked on, is that a lot of the melody and lyric changes actually he had a big hand in.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Dude, one of the craziest things was like, and this is kind of an example that's definitely going to lead in well to what we're talking about. I have a video of this still, which I thought was hilarious because I was just memeing and I was there at like midnight for some reason. I just helped him with something and I was just hanging around because like I said, he was super cool and he would let me hang out just while he was working. And it helped that like his nephew, like growing up, his nephew Brandon was like a good friend of mine who I knew like before I ever knew who Matt was. So it was just kind of like there was this familiarity there that was really nice where we could just kind of like talk and just, you know, like shoot the breeze and whatnot. And I I remember I took this video and I found it recently and I had like an old Instagram post that I associated with it where he's like on the phone and he's holding an acoustic like at his table, and my caption just like picking on him. I was like, who gave this guy a guitar? Because he's like everyone knows him as like the drum guru, and
The
he's
drum
like
guy, yeah.
no one realizes that he has like as much of a sense of melody as he does, even though he is the producer that he is. And one of the things I realized that I had an innate sense for, that when he explained it to me, it wasn't like someone teaching me. It was like, oh, it's like I've thought of that too. You just phrased it to me and now I understand that. I didn't realize I understood that.
He was just unlocking the understanding of your brain.
What he was doing in that picture is he was looking for this melody. Like he was searching for, like he was going up the fretboard, and I think if I recall correctly, he was like working on a melody or a harmony. He was mixing Mel Washington, who used to be in All Get Out. It was like his solo like gospel project, and it was really cool. It had this huge soaring, beautiful vocal section, and there was one harmony that he just made me sing, but he was trying to write the harmony, and he was trying to like look for the melody so that it would be like kind of an alternative harmony to what was in there and kind of make it more soothing. And I didn't understand it when I heard it, but then when I heard it in context, I was like, oh, I see what you're trying to make it not just be like this big like glory to God kind of gospel choir thing. You wanted it to be kind of like very like almost like it has this sense of finality to it. And it was cool because little details like that, and also just him remarking on like a record I was producing. It was with the band Stay Here. I called him one time in the middle of the night while I was arguing with them about like a lyric change or something, and I was like saying, I was just being very bullheaded, and I was like trust me guys, like you're not gonna want to use the way, like the line was I clean my hands of this. And I was saying, that doesn't make any sense. I understand what you're trying to say, but you want to say I wash my hands of this? And so I was trying to argue with them. And when I was in my 20s, I was way more fiery about like, I say that like as if I didn't just turn 30. But like when I was like in my mid 20s, like producing bands a lot, I had this very fiery idea of like, I'm right at the end of the day. Like you're right with your vision, and I want to help you accomplish your vision. But so much of me back then was like, but ultimate say is I'm right, and I'm going to know what's best for this thing, which I kind of learned is not how to do things a little bit later.
Yeah.
And but it was funny. I called Goldman like in the middle of the night, basically, and I was like, hey, settle this dispute for me and this band right here. And I put him on speaker, and I was like, the line, I wash my hands of this. This makes way more sense saying I clean my hands of this. And he was like saying, okay. He's like, I understand what you're saying about wash my hands. He's like, but to be fair, I think clean sings better is the way he put it. And like the whole bit, they're like, yeah, they were all like cheering and everything. And they were like, they were like, they're like, in your face, IJR. And I was like, yeah, no, y'all are right. And sure enough, that's the line that ended up on the record. And when I hear it now, I'm like, I hadn't considered what, in regards to like what he was saying, I hadn't considered like, oh yeah, that's going to sing better. And ultimately like what's going to be the thing that people like kind of latch onto. And the thing that I learned a lot from him, all this to say, is like, it's not just hooks are important, but it's not just the hook. It's like the song has to have this identity that is the reason you're coming back to the song. It can't just be vocals over parts. For some types of music that works, like for like hardcore, that's like, like kind of just straight hardcore. It is essentially just parts with lyrics over it, and that's fine. But a lot of times the best songs, no matter what genre, like just think music, like, take surface level, arbitrary genre, subgenre debate out of the equation. Our favorite songs, so much of it comes from both musically and like lyrically. There's like an identity there. And that's something you and I have talked about a ton, is like, having something with identity to come to from the very beginning, even if it's like just a part, or if it's like a chorus that you start out, no matter what you start out with, it's like trying to figure out what is the song kind of without sounding like lofty and pretentious about it, what is the song telling you it is? You know what I mean? And then just kind of letting that be the guiding principle behind like the production aspect as well. So yeah, no, that's kind of what kind of led me more, I guess, into working in the capacity that I did with production the next following few years, because that was like 2017, 18-ish era that I'm talking about now. So this is after I was done working at Glow in the Dark when he closed that location, and then I was working at Toast and Jam Studio with Don Maduri for a little bit. And at that point in time, I was working with bands a lot. like bands, you know, like whether they're like indie, emo, pop punk, rock, like, you know, stuff like that, even like some like metal and like hardcore, like the Callous Daoboys and whatnot.
Yeah.
But I think around that time, this is just before the pandemic, I was talking to you a lot around that era about like kind of like we were both kind of really in that phase of like, this is before pop, kind of like, especially modern newer pop artists, like I'm not trash talking, but like, but this is before a lot of modern newer pop artists kind of really oversaturated that market with like the whole sad boy pop, like pastel color thing we were talking about the other day. This is before that really thing, that boom happened in like 2019, 2020, 2021. You and I were really into this wave of newer, fresher pop kind of centric music. And I've, you know, me, everyone memes me to death about this, but like, you know, one of my favorite bands in the world has always been Coldplay, and that's and like bands like that, the 1975 and whatnot. But I'm not interested in like ripping off the aspects of what they do and trying to make my version of that. And I think what I remember talking to you a lot around this time, we were working with bands a lot more, was I was like, you know, I eventually want to get into like not just songwriting in terms of for other artists, but I want that to be like my main thing as a producer, where it's like, even if I'm facilitating my own sounds and producing up ideas at home, which ended up being the case once the pandemic hit, because then we all got on Discord and started doing this whole job remotely. A lot of what I realized I was good at, on top of kind of like tone building and figuring out what the song needed to sound like, it was figuring out the identity of the song. And that era that you and I spent like kind of like going back and forth about when we were talking about like Troye Sivan and Lauv and, you know, all those artists that were like kind of really starting to break at the time. This is even before Joji. Or before he was,
this is
when he
very,
was still
and this,
yeah.
Yeah, and this is very well, like probably our first record, Joji, and like I do remember that. I do remember that conversation, because we were very much in this thing of, we saw the rise of like the rise of like alt pop.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even full fleshed. Yeah, it wasn't even fully fleshed out there, because even Troye Sivan is like really not alt pop. Really, it's more of like, it's just pop music, but there were aspects of it that led us down a rabbit hole of like other things that ended up being places like the band Camino, early band Camino, or or like early Nightly, or bands like that now are like established in the alt pop, especially underground Nashville pop. A lot of people just call it Nashville pop now, scene. But me and you were very much in that, like, we were vibing with that in like that 2018 kind of section. And to before we get too far into that, I want that 2018, this is another context for other people to know.
For sure.
I want to very much dive into your role in the Atlanta scene at large. So because I think that is very that sheds a lot of light into your production, but also moving forward, the stuff that you're doing now, and how like you still have a hand in it, but you're also kind of stepping not away to the side and keeping it at arm's length more so now. So in 2018, I believe, was that when we first met on that farm tour?
We first met. It was either late 2017 or early 2018. I guess it probably, because I met them before I met you. But you know, so it was the first time I guess it would have been it would have been early 2018 when y'all had just done the EP.
Yes,
and so it was getting that was when Alt Press was like picking it up and everything.
You had. I noticed you had seen a very big decline in the scene at large, and the scene being just like anything underground, anything not hip hop, essentially.
I can totally speak into that, and I'll try to keep it as concise as possible, because I
feel like you have a good. I feel like you have a good concise version of this.
So I think that. So the decline you're talking about, I would always refer to as like the old days. So like everyone, like our friends, like Hance and his band Woe Is Me, and like you know, a lot of my friends from back then, there was a scene we came up in like the late 2000s to like early 2010s that kind of died once a lot, at least locally, once a lot of bands either kind of broke up and stopped doing the thing, or they kind of like signed to a label and they became popular in like the alternative culture, like Warped Tour and stuff, and they just kind of weren't as present like as a local thing anymore. The only bands that I knew were really
the fall of those that know Rise Core kind of coincided with the fall and decline of the Atlanta Atlanta underground scene as a whole.
And subsequently to the rise of like the very popular wave of like I'm talking about even before 2013, but that led to that big crest of it in 2013 and 14 of like the newer pop punk acts that were like super popular on Warped Tour and stuff. That wave of stuff would influence the newer bands that would come up in the scene, not really having any idea about the other bigger bands in the scene that have existed before them. And I was kind of like in a good place to be like at the junction of both, because I'd witnessed all of it. And I didn't even really intend to start producing bands immediately. What ended up happening was that as some people, but probably most wouldn't know from this, my old band 10th Row, our singer Kevin passed away just randomly in May of 2016. And what ended up happening was, I'll try to make this as short as I can. When that happened, I didn't intend us ever getting back together, which we did as a band later on with his partner Jessica as the vocalist. But what ended up happening was I kind of was in this space in like 2016 where I wasn't sure if I wanted to really be in a band anymore. I was like 23 because like I was like, you know, kind of like recoiling from losing my friend, and from like that was like the one band I had that was actually kind of starting to do some stuff, and we were just doing it for fun. Like we were just kind of like, we had started the band completely as a joke, and I was in college at the time, and I was just kind of like thinking to myself, maybe I'll just get really into production and do this stuff. But what I ended up seeing was I had watched this whole wave of music before me kind of go away. And then there were all these new kids starting up these bands that needed a place to play. And a lot of my best show experiences early on were at this church at the time called CCC. It was Central Christian Church. And then that turned into the Awake venue and the Awake Youth Group. And that was where so many bands came from. Like even the earliest iterations of CCC, some of our friends, like my friend Spencer Ussery, he went on to be in Big Jesus, but he was like an early member of Manchester Orchestra, and before that, he was the frontman for Oh Brother, like in the very beginning in that band. So like, that wave of that era kind of birthed all these bands that kind of stuck around. Like that indie rock wave kind of was the only thing that really survived that earlier phase of music before these new kids kind of came up. And then I met a lot of the bands that I was working with just because they needed a place to play, and I had a venue that was like, my church was the last offshoot from the same pastor of those two previous churches where we had all these shows. So he just kind of like would let me book shows there, and then all these bands, like the band Stay Here and like Blurry, Hindsight, now Tear Blue, you know, they would kind of like just kind of take up residence, and that would be like their venue, you know, and they would practice there and stuff. And it was cool because I had a spot to like let these kids play shows. And at the time I had just moved to an apartment right by the church. So I was there all the time, and they would bring their friends and bands who were touring from out of state, whether it was like locally to the Southeast or like regionally, like from like Canada. And I would meet all these bands, and I was thinking to myself, you know, Atlanta, both in the generation of the music scene before this one and this one, and then the small bits of it that kind of like overlap where there are still musicians doing stuff now from that era. Atlanta has this beautiful thing where I noticed that all of the artists were really like, there are your pockets of like metal and pop punk bands who all sound the same, you know, stuff like that.
Sure.
Even hip hop to some degree. But for the most part, the ones that really stand out, like when you can name the most popular acts in your scene and all of them sound completely different from one another, and all of them also kind of have this beautiful kind of unique Atlanta kind of like it's a je ne sais quoi kind of element, but it's like this very alty kind of attitude, this thing that you only get from Atlanta, and it's like kind of it's not even a chip on the creative shoulder kind of thing so much as it's like, yeah, we know what we're creating, and it's this good, you know what I mean? It's like, it's the stuff that births everything from like Zach Fox to the Callous Daoboys. You know what I mean? It's like or you know, Donald Glover, who's originally he's from Atlanta, and to stuff like Manchester Orchestra. It's like there's this beautiful thing where it's like it's not so homogenous that like you talk about Atlanta as like a music city, and then you're like, oh yeah, you know, that's where like Nashville, I know there's a ton of music, but a lot of people be like, oh yeah, Nashville, that's where all the country music is, you know.
Yeah.
Or people would say hip hop from Atlanta, but there's a lot of crossover. You know, you have like stuff like Jid, who's like one of my favorite hip hop artists right now, or Black, who
from
you
EAV.
showed me, you know.
Yeah,
Exactly. Like so much
which
good
are
hip hop
totally
released in Atlanta
different
Village.
than any other kind of hip hop originally from Atlanta, like 2 Chainz.
And then you have the Callous Daoboys, and even earlier in like the mid 2000s, and that like really mathy, chaotic, heavy music. And you had Me and Him Call It Us, who was like legendary, and people don't even realize it's from Atlanta. And then you have, you know, like Manchester Orchestra is one of the biggest indie rock kind of bands of their type in that wave, and they come from like the same community we do in Gwinnett County.
Or Microwave being like a newer version of that from that
exactly
scene. Yeah.
And it's like there's this kind of almost like with all the different artists in our scene, there's equally almost kind of like this like crusty element that's very like we're kind of dirty and punk a little bit, as there is this refined, beautiful songwriting element where it's like it feels like a lot of the time some of my favorite artists, even if they're smaller, like I always see artists from out of state being like, or whatever, I've been fortunate enough to work with or meet artists from out of state, they're like, man, I wish our scene was like Atlanta's, because everyone here sounds the same, and like everyone just wants to rip off whatever the bands in your city are doing and what the artists in your city are doing, even if especially if it's like hip hop or pop. And it was cool for me to see all that like in my like teens growing up, because I didn't really realize how special it was. Even just listening to like Usher when I was a kid, I didn't realize how special that sound was until I got older and became a producer and a songwriter. I was like, oh, this really is something that like this and Outkast and all of this, these guys were like originators of things. They weren't just a part of like a flock, you know?
I think that also something that is kind of derived from that, you said crusty, and I was like, that's a very good, I view it from a more of a like, you can't say of anybody that comes out of the Atlanta scene that they didn't work hard for it.
Yeah.
Like there is no this is handed to them on a silver platter.
None.
Even bands that were restart bands like and Issues, they still had to grind from the beginning.
From the beginning, like
because
Michael
no one was handing them anything.
Funny you bring them up too, because like Michael was literally telling me about how he was just like, he told me this a couple months ago, but we were just talking about newer bands, and we're talking about like, you know, like the expectations of the industry and stuff like this, and that's a whole other topic we can get into another time.
Sure.
But he was telling me, he's like, you know, we didn't get popular right off the rip. He's like, we took a tour with A Day to Remember early on. And it was like, I think it was something like, he's like, and we took it because we were just happy to get it. We knew we'd do fine in merch, hopefully. But they were like the opener, or like second of 4, I think. And he was like, and we did it for like $100 or like $150 a night, something like that. And it was like, I was like, dude, y'all really like, y'all grinded for it. You really did to get to be able to headline the rooms that you did later on.
The stories that Nate and Tito talk about of like early Microwave days of them literally living in a van for like 6 months. And just grinding tours and coming back and working for a couple days, and then grinding another tour, and then coming back and working for another couple days too.
And that's the thing is, like, I think this thing is so many people don't realize that like a lot of these artists that are special, that have this kind of really beautiful like songwriting element, it's all from like super real world experience. Like there's a reason, and that was something I learned that stuck with me. But to answer like the thing you were asking initially and kind of tie that back into it, I noticed that there was this quality pool that was building from all these shows that I was fortunate enough to just be able to throw at my church. So because I had this, you know, this unique situation to be able to throw these shows, and I had a place to do it, I was like, I should start throwing like little fests and stuff here and there, because like there's a really cool showcase of like unique talent, and like all of us, we're all in the same scene, but we all sound so different from one another. And to pull that onto a bill, that it echoed the shows that I grew up going to, which were like insane mixed bill shows, whether it would be like indie rock bands, pop punk bands, hardcore, like a post rock band, an acoustic songwriter. Like we literally had a thing in my old church called Indie Fest, and like you know, kind of like wannabe pop artists back then, because back then, this is like pre Lady Gaga. I'm talking about like the early, like late late 2000s, early 2010s. And there would be these kind of like different style pop artists from back then, if you can imagine what that looked like in a local scene that existed. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so I would see all this stuff and I would be like, there's no reason we can't all like kind of occupy a same space. And then I realized also at that same time, when I was kind of becoming a full-time music producer, I was like, this is a great way to build like a client base, because I need to like pay my bills. I'd like just really started producing full time. I was like driving for Uber and Lyft to make extra money, and I needed to pay my rent. So I was like, any band that I thought was like someone I could actually contribute to, because I've really been fortunate in the sense that I've never to this day worked on a project or with an artist that was just like for money. I've been fortunate enough that like everyone I've worked with is something I actually wanted to work with, or was like one of my favorite artists at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was usually because like I would be in the middle of all these things, just booking shows and kind of being in studios. And I would basically be like, I would just talk to bands and I'd be like, hey, y'all are awesome. I produce music at like these studios. If y'all are ever wanting to like make some dope recordings and like have a producer work with you, like, and actually kind of like work on your songs as well, instead of just like hit record, I would love to work with you guys, because like, you know, and just stuff like that. And so that ended up turning into what that kind of community we built. And I can't just attribute it to myself, but I was like in the middle of it with a few other people. Ended up becoming the independent music fest that we call Big Gig, or the Big Ass Gig now, the Bag, with our friend Joe Warren at the Masquerade. And that kind of just became this annual thing we would throw in earlier in the year, where it would be kind of like this fest emblematic of like, this is what the scene, not just in Atlanta, but this is what independent music looks like. Because we would have some bands from the Southeast, some bands from like up north. We had our friends in the Fairview from Boston, who I would call like, we coined the term with them. I think Nolan from the band actually coined it, but we coined the term red wine emo for them. And we were like, you know, they bring something to the table that we don't have here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But we produced their record. So we were like, this is, you know, this is what music looks like right now. And that was kind of what my goal was. I also did a podcast back then for a little while with Tito. And then he and I both got super busy and we just didn't have time to do it anymore. But where we would interview artists for this exact same purpose, because we would just be working with all these artists. And, you know, ultimate goal was like get Donald Glover on the podcast, essentially, you know, like get like an artist from Atlanta like that. But we were just kind of trying to showcase how dope and how unique the music from where we come from was. And it's funny because that was kind of my role in the scene for a bit. It was I was like, you know, I was producing a lot of artists. I was booking shows at a church. I ended up creating the Big Gig and then booking that thing. And I was also playing bass and touring in a bunch of bands, including in Harm with you. And that kind of like playing in this indie rock band that we're friends with that I love called Clavicle, and being in 10th Row all at the same time really kind of spread me kind of thin. And I was like really fulfilled creatively because I was doing all these different things, but I hadn't quite like found my thing yet. I was just really helping essentially to facilitate a lot of other artists happening, which was my dream. I wanted to do that, you know. And
in Clavicle, you were very much just like you helped. You were kind of the producer, but you were more just like the bass player. And then in Harm, you were very much the bass player, because that is very much, we both realize, it's very much Andy and Billy's like thing. And so like the voice has to be them, and me and you were kind of just there to facilitate and me still, but you were also there to help me facilitate their vision.
Our kind of idea, our role as facilitators in Harm, I think, is really funny because we were in the band and like we were essentially the fanboys who got to also be in the band. And not let the self-deprecating like artists kind of like be down on their own art. So half of our contribution is production, apart from like recording and actually producing,
hyping up Andy.
We're just saying, no, this idea is good enough, and validating the idea, which I think
this is really good.
Which I think is a massive role of a producer. Like that was something I learned. Like, well, with
like
all
you
the
said,
artists I've worked with,
finding these bands that you were actually fans of, you got to see them live first, and like see if you actually liked them or not enough to even want to work with them.
Right.
Whether or not they cared about working with you or not, it was more of like, I am at the core a fan of what you do. I would love to be a part and do that with you if you would have me, but also if not, that's also fine. I'm just here to like be
I'm
a
here
fan.
just to book your show, because that's essentially what I was doing. And it was cool because I had so much work during that era anyway that like I was never truly hurting. Like I was able to pay all my bills, even if it was really tight sometimes. I definitely was like always just keeping an eye open. You know what I mean? Like I started the shows just to do the shows. And that was cool too, because that led that you know, like you said, especially with Clavicle, that was a really good example. On the first record, I really was just the producer because Dom was around for a little bit with that one. But for me, it was basically like I wasn't even the bass player yet. They didn't have a bassist, kind of like with Harm. But in that position, I was just like, well, I'll write the bass parts and I'll track them, because I was already playing with 10th Row and they'd played with us as 10th Row. So I was like, I can just write the bass parts and track them. You guys can get a bass player. And but I helped kind of facilitate the atmosphere of those songs on that first EP, because I could tell that's a lot of what they wanted, was like the dreamy kind of thing. And that was kind of a lot, that and Harm, as opposed to just being in 10th Row, and just being in my own band, really taught me a lot of what I love to do in terms of production is not just be involved as the bass player, like because I end up joining the band by default, but it's that I love creating like the atmosphere and the texture and the mood of like a universe that you're hearing with whoever I'm working with, whether I'm the one behind the computer or not. I'm trying to help nail down what's the identity of this instead of letting it just be drums, guitar, and bass and vocals. And then two, I really want the songs to be this thing that sticks out, that like really like, because all my favorite records, unless it's like post-rock or instrumental stuff, like I love electronic music, but unless it's that kind of music, all my favorite records are the ones where the songs like devastate me, where like what they have what I call like the tattoo lyric, you know what I mean, where it's like it's stuff that is like, and that could be anyone, that could be, you know, stuff
my friend Ray calls it my friend Ray Rock, who's producer for like Andy Mineo and Lecrae and like all that whole crew.
The goats.
He calls it the phrase that pays.
That's exactly. That's such a good way to put it. And for me, it's like I love that idea because it's so much more than just like having the right hook. Because I know there's so many young pop artists now who like, oh, if we have just the one sad boy hook that's like the, you know, the but I just wish you missed the way you or like I just wish you missed me the way I miss you kind of thing, you know, like just something that feels like, not taking shots, I'm just saying like it's like I've seen this particular trope so many times, something where the art, like the album art, is literally like an iMessage bubble, and you see like the hook lyric there, and I'm like, this is cool, but like I know exactly what this vibe is. It's not really like, it's a hook and it's good, but it's like for the sake of having a hook. Whereas then there's like a song that like you've never heard this hook before, you've never heard this thing, and it's only the way this artist could write it. It just came from the heart and like a moment,
and it cuts deep, and
and it's the thesis for the whole thing. Like that was what I was starting to really, especially with Clavicle and just being around Harm, and being in the band, I really started to learn. It's funny because one's an indie rock band, one was like, you know, kind of like a post-hardcore like type project. That's a little more like layered, but the hallmark of the things I noticed that I wanted to bring out was the same thing, which was like, I want to see the songs become stronger. I want to see them have their own identity without you having to give them that after you've already written a badass instrumental. You know what I mean? Like I just really, really want to see the songs always become stronger. And it's funny because that led our mutual friend and bandmate Ryan Love back into my life.
That's all for this episode. Thank you so much for hanging out with us today. Thank you so much for Ian for giving us his time. If you want to follow him, check him out at Ian Joshua Riley on all socials, and follow us at Home Studio Hangout on all the socials. If you're watching this on YouTube, give a subscribe and a like to keep up with all of the episodes and clips and things that drop on this channel. Once again, thank you so much for your time and your attention. And we'll see you next week with the second half of Ian's episode.